You're considering getting into watch collecting, but it's expensive and you don't want to make mistakes. So you go to the internet and you go to YouTube and you look for experienced collectors who can advise you on what to do and what not to do when starting out as a watch enthusiast. I hate to break it to you, but there's a lot of bad advice out there, and I'm going to do my very best to guide you away from some of the less good advice. Sometimes even good advice has downsides. So here are some of the advices that people give that maybe you should consider getting a second opinion on. Let's dive in. First of all, don't take any advice that has the starting point of how you get into watch collecting. I think the premise is wrong. The key to getting into photography, as an example, is not by buying a ton of equipment. With watches, you start with one watch and one watch only. And from there, over time, you figure out whether or not you feel the need to buy another watch. Collecting isn't something you just start. It's something that might happen if it turns out you enjoy diving into some aspect about watches. It also might not happen. Your first watch is always about getting a watch that you like. It's not about starting a collection. The other day, an acquaintance of mine who found out I have a YouTube channel asked if I could advise him on a new watch he wanted to buy. And I said, sure, fine, I'm happy to. And then he sent me a link to an IWC Portuguese perpetual calendar in rose gold that he'd been looking at. So I wrote him a lengthy email about older Portuguese models, about IWC's history with movements, the details of the Court Class perpetual calendar, which is crown operated versus the thinner but pusher style perpetuals you find on Patek and JLC. I babbled on about gold and value retention, and I did send him about 1 million different options. But afterwards I thought, had I actually advised him, or had I just told him what I liked and what I don't like? Had I taken the time to understand what he liked and what he was looking for? I've overheard similar encounters of experts trying to ram a moonwatch down the throat of someone just looking for a nice chronograph. I've also overheard enthusiasts try to talk people both in and out of buying Rolex. The problem with listening to us enthusiasts is we are really particularly good at giving good advice because none of us are qualified advisors. We are typically very good at telling you about the facts and the details, and we are also very skilled at mixing our own opinions about watches and brands into the mix. But we're just not particularly good at listening to what you're looking for and understanding what that translates into and meeting you where you are. We inevitably, more often than not, end up pushing something on you that might not make sense for you. And this is where I plug my channel. I'm not an expert. I get things wrong every now and again, more often than not. I'm constantly learning, but my goal is to make videos that you feel are worthy of your time and make you want to come back for more. If that's the case, then there's the subscribe button below. Click it if you feel it's warranted, and you won't miss out on my videos in the future. Thanks a ton. Don't listen to people about diameters, wrist sizes, lug to lugs, and thicknesses. If people are telling you that you with your 6¼ inch wrist should not be wearing something that has more than a 47.6 millimeter lug to lug, you shouldn't be listening to them. What you should be doing is wearing the watch in the store and taking a picture of it and asking whoever's with you in the store how it looks. And you should be asking yourself how it feels on your wrist. Over time, lug to lug and diameters become relevant as you get a personal idea of what works to you, and you get an understanding of whether or not 48.2 millimeters is a relevant size for you, because you've worn so many watches around that size that you know that they do. I, for example, know for a fact that a lot of Omega models wear smaller than their lug to lugs would indicate, so I don't always trust those measurements. I also know that most square, rectangular, or tonneau cases on my wrist need to be a medium. Large and extra large often don't really work for me. I also know that Nomos lugs don't bother me in the slightest. 42 millimeters also wears very differently depending on whether it's a dress watch or a dive watch. The only way to know in the beginning of your journey is not the numbers. It's the actual fit on your wrist as you try it out. The numbers become more relevant later on. Another advice that you might get is to get 2 or 3 watches. People suggest that you have options for different scenarios, making your collection versatile from the beginning. And intuitively, that makes sense. If you buy a dress watch, then you don't have a casual watch to go swimming with or, something. But it's predicated on you becoming some kind of collector, and maybe you're not. You'll also be stuck with the challenge of not just finding one good watch, but having to find 2. Finding one nice watch to start with is hard enough. I love the idea of slicing the pie, but the reality is that's easy for me, who's been wasting my money on these watches for 30 more years. I really know what works and what doesn't work for me. But I could never in the beginning have known that a white dial Breitling Chronomat would lead to a black dial dress Chrono Portofino. There was no way of ever figuring out that those two watches would ever complement each other at the time. Don't listen to anybody that tries to talk you out of or into a brand. If you like Hublot, you like Hublot. It's fine to understand why people have trouble with Hublot. Incidentally, it's about cheap movements, but you do you. There are Rolex haters out there. There are people that will spit on Tudor, and likewise, there are people for whom Omega can do absolutely nothing wrong. But we have to be very clear on two things. One, all of these brands are in it to make money. Two, these days things are so transparent that price and quality is usually pretty comparable across brands. There are outliers out there here and there, but largely a $1,000 Tissot is going to be largely as good as a $1,000 Hamilton, which is likely going to be largely as good as a $1,000 Seiko. Supply chains are interlinked. The parts and manufacturing ecosystem is transparent to all the brands. So generally, again, there are exceptions. Brands see what the other brands do and copy each other in terms of features, price points, and quality. They even go to the same supplier fairs and buy from the same suppliers. Things largely end up costing more or less the same for more or less the same quality. At least that's the case once the brands are established. Startups can be a little bit more of a mixed bag, but if the brand's been around for a while, they're probably going to be in the ballpark of brands at similar prices. Someone's going to tell you to do your research, and I'm of the controversial opinion that you don't necessarily have to. Now, hear me out. If you're here, you're already doing your research, and that's perfectly good. But what, honestly, is going to happen if you don't? Imagine a scenario where you wipe the slate clean. You wake up one morning, you decide, I want to buy a watch. You walk down to an AD, you see a watch you like, you buy it. You know nothing about this Breitling brand. You don't know about Metas or Kosk. You don't even know what's a good power reserve. You don't even know why it's relevant. You didn't compare this Super Ocean model to anything else. And then you show it to your watch nerd friend and he says, that's not an in-house movement. And then he says, Breitling, they're not really enthusiast watches. And then he notes that you got it on a rubber strap. And he says, you should always get it on a steel bracelet. It holds value much better. Now, first of all, your buddy is a donkey's backside for one thing. But the point I'm trying to make is you didn't make a mistake. He's just expressing an opinion that doesn't have to have value to you. So you bought a Gucci watch. Are they high horology? No, but you liked it. And maybe, potentially, that Gucci watch is more likely to lead you down the rabbit hole of collecting than a Rolex would. Some people are coded for research. I recently upgraded my PC, and I've been building my own PCs basically since the 80s. I've spent hours this past couple of months going back whether or not I wanted a 9950 X3D or a regular 9900. I've been considering whether a PCI Gen 5 NVMe would be beneficial when editing videos. And don't even get me started on whether or not I should get DDR5 6000 or 8000 RAM with a latency of CL28 or CL26. But that's just me. Some people just want to game and edit and they buy an expensive laptop and they never need to know what it can do. They're just happy that it works. And if you just like the watch, you like the watch. People will often tell you to focus in the beginning on what you like. And it's not inherently wrong advice, but it's predicated on an assumption that you know what you like. Odds are you might not. You might look at a Rolex GMT Pepsi and think that's a nice watch, but you haven't worn it for 6 months in a row, so you don't know how it functions from day to day. It's this weird conundrum that the correlation between liking something before you buy it isn't a one-to-one relationship to liking it after you've worn it for a year. Don't set a budget. This is another hear me out statement. I'm not saying you should overspend. If you don't have $10,000, then don't spend $10,000. But the reason I say don't set a budget is if you set a budget of 10 grand, you're going to end up spending close to 10 grand. Your budget is probably dependent on two things: how much money you have to spend and the kind of status object you want on your wrist. So you've set yourself a $50,000 budget as your limit for your first watch. And if that's what you want, well, that's what you want. But honestly, I'd remove the limitation that the budget sets and I'd look at some $25,000 watches as well, just to see if some of them look nice to me. The perfect case in point for this is $17,000 for a land dweller. I might consider it if my budget was $17,000 because I could buy it and then potentially I'd flip the thing because I don't like it that much. But if you said to me I could choose between an Ingenieur and a land dweller and you didn't tell me what the two cost, I'd get the Ingenieur. And the Ingenieur cost $11,000. But 17 and 11, then the 17 must be better, right? Well, not for me. It's not the price. I'd like the Ingenieur more. It's not markedly worse than a Rolex. And for the right person, it's better. But for someone with a budget of 25K, they might never consider it because it's not in the price range of what they're looking for. The budget you set for yourself will limit your focus to certain brands and watches. I would suggest being open to not having that limit to start with. But of course, don't spend more than you actually have. Anybody that boils advice down to more expensive watches are just branding are just wrong. I don't personally think the Landweller is aesthetically markedly nicer than a Tissot PRX, but I'm under no illusion that Tissot are making a watch anywhere near the build quality of Rolex. No Chinese factory brand is either. It's silly to try and convince oneself or others of this. The more you pay, generally speaking, the better a product you get. Specs in general are important, but not really. Some enthusiasts really get bogged down in specs. Power reserve, depth rating, anti-magnetic properties, they're all relevant. They're all important to some extent. And yes, if you're going to go diving with your watch, you'll want to have faith in the product you buy that it can actually be used for diving. But whether it's a Siloxi or a Nevachrome hairspring is not the make or break feature of your first watch. Double-sided versus single-sided anti-reflective coating is not necessarily a deal breaker. And do you really know what that means? Just look at the watch. So the advice to understand specs is partially okay, as long as you are only lightly mindful of it and don't let it control you. Watches are more than specs, and this is not a world of competitive esports where it's actually important whether or not your monitor's refresh rate is 60 Hz or 240 Hz. Some really, really nice watches only have 38 hours of power reserve. They are not inherently worse than watches with 120 hours of power reserve. There's so much context to all those specs that on a general level, they should be treated at least with a little bit of indifference. A watch is a complete experience and not just a collection of specs, so treat the specs accordingly. Now, obviously, for practical applications, that doesn't apply as much. If you're a diver, depth rating is an important spec. But if you're not, then what does it really matter whether it's 200 or 300 meters of water resistance? I'm looking forward to the comments below. I'm certain someone is going to conclude that I stated that you should spend way over your budget. You shouldn't research anything. All watches are the same quality, and Rolex is just better because it's more expensive. Also, specs don't matter, and YouTube experts are not really experts at all, which is actually true. Honestly, it is fun to read the comments. I've been doing this for 30 years, and the point of this entire video is that I've found my own path. I've guided myself. I've made my own mistakes. Sometimes I've learned something from others. Other times, what they said was, for me, just plain stupid advice. So if there's one thing I'd leave you with, it's you can't go wrong, really. Even your mistakes will inform you. Do what works for you. Listen to other people, but you don't have to do what they say. It doesn't matter. Buy what you like and see where it takes you. Like, subscribe. Cheers.